which is very interesting, and the subject is something that I always pursued, and I was always thinking about how many things should be said and done regarding this East-West binary, which has been always a big, how to say, divide or a problem. And I would like to start with my speech with something which I noted this year, that I have been obsessed by the lack of East European art and artists from most performing arts and film festivals everywhere, even museums and galleries. For example, this year, Venice, Vietnam has opened under the title Foreigners Everywhere, and in the central pavilion are exposed works of 300 artists from all over the world, out of which only 3 were from East Europe. Ana Zemankova, Iva Jankovic, who is working with another artist from Panama, and Želimir Žilnik. And I would like to say that this is not the first time that artists from East Europe are neglected or treated as the missing other on the margins of Europe's new geopolitical, economic, and cultural fault lines. There is a big process of decolonization and deculturalization. It seems there is a little space for that part of the world comprised now of 27 countries that once were divided between Soviet bloc and the non-aligned Yugoslav Federal Republic. Then, if we know that in Europe there are 44 countries, this means that 17 countries are Western European countries. Obviously, then the region needs to be situated as an important focal point for understanding different European art practices of the late 20th and early 21st centuries in ways that venture beyond the generalized divide between the neoliberal West and post-socialist East. And in case we establish performance art in East Europe as an object of our study and historization like in the West, then we will figure out that performance art in the East evolved in many directions, like in West, including body art, conceptual art, happenings, actions, theater and performance, in parallel and in dialogue with practices in Western Europe and North America, despite its exclusion from the canon of that history. But what we lack is a clear methodology that would analyze the complex structure of various socialist countries, including the shifts of power between the communist parties, conservative and liberal factions, as well as increasing rivalry between party elites and their bureaucratic bodies, which contributed to frequent changes in the political and cultural climate. It is also important to note that after 1989, with the triumph of neoliberalism in most of these countries, the discourse of performance art as a model for an alternative art changed from a political subversive into a socially critical one. Therefore, I think there are several principal questions that need to be answered. How and why the discipline of performance art is still divided between East and West? How we can move beyond East-West binary towards a truly global performance art history? And how can we place the East European artists from Europe's margin to its center? Also, how this is called insufficient Europe, this is, I took it from Marina Gržinić's observation, could become sufficient enough as an integral part of Europe beyond East-West binary. Although the Berlin Wall was destroyed, other many invisible walls were constructed between East and West. Therefore, my attempt is to re-establish the importance and centrality of the performance art in former East Europe and to give an insight at their status and connection to the epistemologies that derive from different practices, tracing the consequences in terms of methodologies, genealogies, and epistemological shifts in the rest of Europe. It is important to mention that these performances and different art forms have existed already at the beginning of the 20th century and almost as parallel universes. For example, many years ago, I had participated in a project which was called Dissident Nudes from 1945 until 1991, a research launched by Dragan Klaić and the Netherlands Theatre Institute. And from that I learned how different were East European countries always placed in one block, but these countries were different in producing but also repressing the performance art. What helped me and other scholars in their research was a number of oral histories and also private archives of individuals. Therefore, it is not enough to apply the comparative method of what an art historian Piotr Piotrowski defined as horizontal art history in 2012, because the dissimilarities among the countries of East Europe require more diversified interpretations. Thus, I am more akin to the concept and methodology of microhistories introduced and developed by French social historian Ivan Jablonka, to whom I will be back in a moment. Perhaps we should start from the significance of the fall of communism, not only for Central and East Europe, but also for the rest of the world, and how is this event situated within the condition of global contemporaneity. For example, Susan Bach-Moore noted that the post-communist condition did not only affect East Europe, but it had a much larger impact on the rest of the world. From the privileged standpoint of West Europe, it was called the Cold War, but from the other, less privileged side, it was a very hot war, as Tomasz Masnak put it. Tomasz Masnak is also right when he's indicating that post-socialism represents the defeat of socialism by liberalism. According to him, socialism collapsed not only because of internal problems and contradictions, but under Assad pressures which were aggravated by hostility and isolation. What he noted was that socialism was always under the permanent hybrid war and was surrounded by a hostile world, and it actually lost the Cold War. It was considered the enemy because it stood for an alternative political, economic and social system, alternative to the liberal system of capitalism. So after the Cold War, socialism capitulated and liberalism triumphed, with neoliberalism as its highest stage. East Europe got lost in liberalization and social disintegration, and we all know what happened to Yugoslavia as well as to the Soviet Union. Excuse me. Therefore, instead of defining post-socialism by what it is not, that is, by the absence of socialism, we will define it by what it is, the liberal autocracy and its main traits. Political oppression was replaced by economic oppression. We can see how the uncontrolled and unrestrained economic power pursued and exercised for private gain is destructive for different societies, especially in Serbia, Croatia, Russia. But do not misunderstand me. This is not nostalgia for the old division of Europe, even though some nostalgia is understandable. This is facing the situation we are in. For example, the feminist scholars such as Bojana Kunst, Francesca Coin, and Anna Vujanović are the first to grapple the new situation of what does it mean of being precarious artists in today's world. They are indicated that in the past 30 years there have been a series of shifts that redefine the position of artists in the whole Europe, a shift in defining artists as creative class who can easily slip into new precarious class, which is always on the edge of becoming unemployed, homeless, or proletarian. Thus, the artists in Europe today are usually described as the precarious members of the creative class. Modes of operation of the artist comprehended this way include multitasking, freelancing, flexible personality, the non-stop performance of the self, lifelong learning, blurring of the borders between work and private life, intermittent working conditions including projects and artistic residence, etc., as suggestively described by Bojana Kunst in her seminal book, The Artist at Work, among others. But let's go back to my original argument. Although there are numerous books on performance art histories, most of these deal exclusively with Western performance art and mention only in passing the very few artists from Eastern Europe, such as Marina Abramović or Katarina Kozivia, who have prominent international profiles. As I mentioned in the beginning, there is a big need for a work that explores unfamiliar aspects of and connections between performance art and politics in Eastern Europe, a part of the world that even during the Cold War was more heterogeneous than that was typically granted, being composed of very different communist and socialist countries with diverse social and political regimes, institutions, religions, histories, or famous books which have been written in the meantime, like Amy Brigzel or Piotrowski or Maya and Ruben Faust and people as such, who concentrated more on art, visual art, than the performance art, then we need to go beyond them. We need to how do you say, to do a more profound research, because yes, in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 70s, this kind of art was always subversive, was always against mainstream. It was always, very often it was also clandestine, it was always like a niche, something with only, for only few people and so forth. Now, this kind of work is got less, how would you say, less problematic, less easy, more easier to produce, and it's always about some kind of social issues. You know, it's not like I don't know if I think about at this very moment comes to my mind Selma Selman. I don't know if you know her work. It is always on the edge of performance art, but she's also a visual artist. She's a 30-year-old woman from Bihać, Bosnia, Rome, and she's doing her work, which seems, looks like a socially engaged art, but at the same time, it's very political, because it's always, she's also talking about the problems, issues like of racism and, you know, treatment of women, especially of Rome women and so forth, against feminists and things like as such. So I would say something that the performance art in the Eastern Europe and socialist countries always served as a little, how to say, like a little opening toward freedom. It was always like a, there was a possibility to criticize the regime. It was, there was a possibility to do something. And it was tolerated because it was only for few people, for little public. And now this kind of socially engaged art, you know, you can always do something against like environmental problems or issues like LGBT problems, but it's not the same, it's not so risky, it's not so critical, not so subversive as it used to be in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if I answered your question, but I see it that way. But like a more profound research would give us a much better answer to this.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks for the answer. And Tomasz has another one.
Yes. So you hear me, Alexandra? You probably
yes, I can hear you. Yes.
You don't see me anymore, but you saw me before, so we'll see each other later on. I thank you very much for your wonderful. For a wonderful introduction to the topics of our symposium. I like very much the title of the book of Jablonka, which we could really use for our symposium, the book of my grandparents I never met. So in a way, the research we're doing is the book about theater grandparents we never met. Basically in Slovenia, when we speak about Delak, when we speak about a lot of artists, and I think this is very much linked to the history of to the relation between center and periphery. Did you try to use the system Jablonka? Jablonka speaks about on when trying to historize the performing arts in you're dealing with?
Not yet, but you know, I have to tell you that, you know, intuitively or some kind instinctively, I did that when I did the research in the 90s on the dissident news, because you know how it is when this research has been done in former Russia, it has been done in East Germany, in Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and ex-Yugoslavia. And it was so different in every country. Let's say in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Russia, there was censorship proclaimed by law. So, you know, the people had to obey this kind of law, and if they were working against the law, it was like a very subversive kind of work. Meanwhile, in Yugoslavia, there was not official law, there was not official censorship. And so, you know, there were different ways of using this censorship, like not only self-censorship, but different, like so-called artistic committees, which each theater had and everything, and approved the productions or the text and everything. So, when I did my research, I found out that there were, you know, in one book it has been written that there were only 2 productions censored by law. And one of them was Toplaleja in Slovenia, and the other one was one amatorial company in Belgrade. But that was not true. I found out that there were more than 70 productions banned. And when I entered into the research, what I did, I did this kind of reconstructions, oral histories. I spoke to the authors, to the theater directors, to the writers, to the people who attended these theater shows. I went to the personal archives of the people, things which were hidden. And so I think, you know, the power of the archives, the power of the personal archives, or what we call today affective archives or critical archives, are the most important thing. That's why I use the example of Sadaya Hartman and Tavian Nyong'o, because there are so many people of, let's say, black origin, of African origin, of the slave origin. They don't have any kind of document on which they can base their family histories. So they have to invent these things. They have to go back to different kind of archivization. So the archive becomes something most important, especially personal archives or oral histories. So that's why this kind of method could be useful. And what I'm saying, you know, the method of Piotr Piotrowski is also important when he is talking about hierarchy, about the horizontal method. But still, this horizontal method leaves this binary between East and West. And what is important is to completely erase this binary and say East Europe is equal to West Europe. There were different movements, there were different events, there were different things, you know, when you go and look back at what Oho was doing, or when you know the Ludist movement or Pupilia in Slovenia or Gorgona, all these movements were so powerful, but they're restricted, they're still looked at regional movements. Their real impact are not studied well. They should be studied more.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Do we have some more questions? Maybe just one from me. You were mentioning again the new discoveries. That this is sort of a thing with the 21st century art history. What do you think on? I was thinking, especially when you were telling about the dissident muse. I'm familiar with this work and it's great. But as if the West was eager to find out what was happening in the East in the 1990s, but then had the feeling that there are no new discoveries there and moved to other topics. What are your impressions on those?
Okay, this is really a great question, because this is something what is missing from my paper. This is exactly what I started with, but I never completed. Because Gasper, excellent, because what happened, you know, we were interesting when we were in the 90s behind the Berlin Wall, or Yugoslavia was interesting because we said no to the Russians and blah, blah, blah. We all know by heart this kind of history. At the moment when this stopped, there is not real interest. As I told you, Venice Biennale, you have only 3 artists from East Europe. Meanwhile, there is this whole decolonization, deculturalization process, and we are nowhere there. I mean, you know, there is this acceptance of indigenous artists, of African artists, and not East European artists. Like this part of the world, which is now comprised of 27 countries, does not exist when you look at the film festivals. Only from that, like a Cannes Film Festival, okay, it's an exclusive club. But there you have one Romanian director, maybe Emil Kusturica if he makes a film because he entered that kind of society, and nobody else. And don't tell me that in Slovenia, in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, in Slovakia, in Russia, in Ukraine, there are not great movies and not great movie makers, or for that matter, theater. We only know about now Srebrenikov because he left his country and he's a big dissident in his own country. What do we know about other people? You know, once I remember like 10 years ago, I was at one film festival in Slovakia. I don't remember the name of the place. It is like some kind of spa, very prestigious spa, and they had their a festival of East European films, and they were great, fantastic, you know. Where are these films? We cannot see them nowhere. And even in theater productions, there, you know, or performing arts, there is only Piotr, what is his name, Pavel Pawlensky. And that's it. Pussy Riot, and we don't know anything else about anybody else. So that's why this is an important issue, an important question, which needs to be, how do you say, investigated and researched better.
Yes, sometimes I get the feeling that we're talking to each other. We are all convinced this is an important issue, but it's not, well, it's the question, what would be the strategy to have the West, or to have the bigger world interested in this topic.
Right.
Sorry, Knut and
thank you very much.
Comment. I think it's a little bit misunderstanding that there was interest for Eastern European art, at least in the Scandinavian countries in the 1990s. There were many films from Poland, Romania, and also from Czechoslovakia. And in theater, there were also many visiting directors, especially from the Baltic countries. So it's not such a black hole of orientation, but Scandinavia has a special position as a kind of listening post to Eastern Europe, and also to Russia at the time. The point is that there was no interest in the West, but the West is very divided into different parts. At least in Germany and Scandinavia, there were interests. There was strong interest. I was myself many times in Zagreb to the Ojlukas Festival and visiting Gordana. But I agree there was some kind of reluctance towards Eastern art due to a cultural misunderstanding. Maybe I can talk a little bit more of that in my contribution tomorrow. But the image, the picture of East to West is not so limited as I think he gave the impression of. If I missed it.
No, I didn't. This is not true, I'm only saying that before there was more interest, and you were talking about your experience in the past. I'm talking now. Now there is no interest. It's like, now is like more, there are so little information that are coming from the east to the west, that there is still invisible divide. That's what I think. Before it was more interesting because it was always this aura of dissident artists or people who are creating something completely different, so even exotic.
Yeah, but in the 1990s there was not dissident, was it? It was after the fall of the wall and the
It was after the fall, but after 2000, this kind of interest diminished. That's what that
no,
was.
I don't agree fully. I can see your point, but I don't agree because there are some exceptions of bringing Eastern European artists even in the 2000s to festivals in I don't know, Scandinavia or in Germany. The Theater in Berlin is very much looking for that. But maybe there is a slight fall of interest in after 2000. That could be. I shouldn't contest that.
Thank you, Knut. We're taking the last question from Diana Fluini, but you have to come here. So Alexander, here is you.
Hello, do you feel me?
Hi.
Yeah.
I
Thanks
can
a
tell you
lot.
better.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your lecture. Well, this might sound frivolous or what, but since you were speaking about this last Venice Biennale, I thought, do you think there is a big change because of the war? That the interest for East, well, this is very new, war is quite recent, but
The war in Ukraine?
yes.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. You know, it's different because, as you know, Venice Biennale is composed of two things. You know, each country has their national pavilion, and then there is like a curatorial exhibition, a central pavilion, which is economics. Furthermore, if the histories of art, theater, and cinema in the Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall were characterized by heavy political censorship, often implemented by law, then this kind of censorship was certainly unavoidable in the world of performance art. The main question then is such as whether performance art was really subversive or not, important or not, and what its legacy might be. These are only tackled partially by only a few books written by Westerners, the American Amy Briggsell or two British authors, Maya and Ruben Fowkes, who founded Post-Socialist Art Center in London. This is also interesting. I mean, like a little note, a footnote to all this speech, that most of these studies come from the Western Europe. What I want to say that Eastern Europe art has been studied by Western arts historians. And for example, this Post-Socialist Art Center is dedicated to the study of the art and visual culture of socialism and post-socialism from a global perspective. They lead different research, they publish different books. They also include Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They have curatorial activities, artistic collaborations, teaching and supervisions, public lectures and events. But I'm not sure that this center is, how do you say, knowledgeable enough to know what really happened in the culture of socialism and post-socialism from a point of view, from a diversity of historical and also political and economical and social point of view. That's why it is more important to find out how and why the discipline of performance art history is still divided between East and West, how we can move beyond this East-West binary towards a truly global history, and how we can position the artists from the region within within that schema remain in part answered. However, one finds out that the truth is perhaps too complex and multi-layered, that there are different meanings in whatever survives of the political and military bloc that once existed and now is dissolved. Whereas most critics and scholars who write about recent performance art tend to privilege its historical precedents in Western Europe and in the United States, the more inclusive and balanced account of performance and experimental art in former Eastern Europe, contextualizing it in relation to other artistic movements in Western Europe is needed. Some of you probably know the book Art History and Modernism, written by Hans Belting, one of the leading European art historians who writes about two voices of art history, the Western and the Eastern. For him, one of the main tasks facing art history today is to ensure the coexistence of two very different and sometimes contradictory art historic narratives. He believes that art produced in East Europe differs fundamentally from art produced in West Europe. That is because East Europeans believed in the power of art that was a long time ago vanished in the West. And according to Ilya Kabakov, for example, art is a necessity of life, not a professional activity, as supposedly it is in West Europe, which I don't agree completely. But a significant number of East European art historians, artists, curators have always tended to see themselves participating in the universal or rather Western culture. They even went so far to willingly forget historic sources of their culture, attempting to position themselves on a global and universal plane and not regional frame of references. There is another art historian now coming from this part of the world, Marija Oriškova from Slovakia, who in her book Two Voices of Art History noted that the history of East Europe art has been purposely omitted from art history books after the 1945. She has analyzed the complex network of factors that led to this state of affairs. In her opinion, both sides are guilty in this. East European art critics provided their Western counterparts with a simplified view of the local art scene based on the so-called dissident paradigm of art making, which valorized resistance. But the Westerners accepted this and gave it a marginal status. So when we talk about this, we cannot simply forget the work of Moderna Galleria and the work of Irving Group. The collection project started in 2000 as a result of an international collaboration of art critics in the region. The second project, the Map of East Europe, art has been undertaken by the group Irving, but somehow stopped in 2006. Maybe I'm wrong, you can always correct me in this, but I didn't find anything beyond 2006. They tried to actually create a cartography of East European art, the map that not only included specific words and artists, but also the links and artistic relationships. Both projects were envisioned to produce a landscape of East European art scene. The 1900s and early 2000s were the period where there were several attempts to make a confrontation between two art worlds and to introduce more seriously East European art world. One of the most significant attempts was an exhibition Interpol that was staged in the form of a dialogue between East and West in Stockholm in 1996. The exhibition Interpol at Fabriken was realized as a result of a long-term project conceptualized by two curators, Victor Misiano from Russia and Jan Amann from Stockholm. According to the initial concept, the project was envisioned as a cooperation based on discussion on one Western and one Eastern artist, with the aim to start a dialogue between two worlds and to turn it into something immanent beyond the project itself, where the curators were working as mediators on the artist collaboration, stimulating them to open their ideas to each other, making them more interactive and interwoven. This is a quote from the program. The exhibition ended up in a scandalous way and transformed into a widely debated study case, where not only the possible challenges and failures of the curatorial practice became extremely important case of a further examination, but also the individual and cultural political difference in the West and the rest context. Everything failed after the scandals created with two Russian artists, Oleg Kulik and Alexander Brenner. Alexander Brenner destroyed the artwork of a Chinese artist, Sven Hu. And Kulik, who played the dog, a performance he did before, beat some visitors. The audience found aesthetic pleasure to observe him as a dog, but only as he did not behave as one. But when he started to behave as one, his performance was described as a direct attack against art, democracy, and freedom of expression, a classical model of imperialistic behavior. Indeed, the other has to be passive, submissive, victim, other with a big O. Kulik was perceived as a Russian dog, and not any other dog, a stranger and enemy. So in spite of the end of the Cold War, the West continues to play the role of the master, while the East is sometimes referred as a folk. This also reminds me of what Alexander Denic, a visual artist from Serbia and also a scenographer who works with many theater directors in Germany, especially now the name got out from with Frank Castor. And he was for a long time labeled as a Serbian artist, and only after he was admitted into German Art Academy and had an exhibition at the Venice Biennale, this changed. Now they're not saying always when they say Alexander Denic, a Serbian artist, but they say an artist or Alexander Denic. Drawing inspiration from different disciplines such as social science, psychoanalysis, feminist and queer studies, there are many sources that can help produce a critical performing arts history. It is interesting to note that the process of deculturalization and decolonizing discourse could be found everywhere, but not regarding East Europe. For example, one of the most remarkable discourses of performance studies in the 21st century comes from the introducing intersectional perspective on queer and black, brown, and indigenous artists and performance tactics, tools and methods. Intersectionality, as conceptualized by Black American feminists such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and later by many others, although these two positions and identities had existed throughout the performance studies of the 90s, also have been parallel universes. Therefore, one can observe a steady development of queer theory starting from the first conference organized by Teresa de Laurentiis in 1990. It had developed as predominantly white theory based on French post-structuralism, especially Michel Foucault's work, and with strong works of Eva Kosowski-Sedgwick, Lauren Verlon, and Judith Butler, who introduced this theory in the field of performance studies in the early 1990s. On the other hand, many non-white scholars developed their work within the study field or in wider spheres of humanities, cultural anthropology, and ethnology in relation to performance. They sometimes created their own discourses of indigenous, diasporic, black and brown performing artists, such as famous Paul Gilroy's study of transatlantic black cultural exchange and diasporic music in the Black Atlantic. However, in the section between being queer and being black, brown, and indigenous, excuse me, seemed not to be enhanced until the late 1990s and early 2000s. In addition, the term Afrofuturism that appeared in the US in the early 1990s offered a fruitful conceptual tool to elaborate African diasporic artistic and performance production regarding technology, science fiction, cyberpunk, speculative fiction, and so forth. African futurism opened performance studies to the speculation and fiction of those whose past is full, of course, of pain, suffering, death, and wounds, that it requires extraordinary effort to imagine the future. Later on, especially one other scholar, Tavia Nyong'o, Afrofabulation, it will be stabilized as a mainstream academic discourse, which draws from a study from another feminist, black feminist scientist, Saida Hartman's concept and practice of critical fabulations, and again, the experience of queer artists of color. Both Hartman and Nyong'o claim that it's not only about changing and repairing the past, but also about opening space for new discoveries. So, now you're probably wondering why did I devote this part. You cannot see me. Can you see me?
No, we hear you.
Sorry. You can see me now.
No.
I can see myself.
Now we just see a black screen.
And now?
No, not yet.
Alexandra, try to click on gallery view. Gallery view.
Yeah, I'm doing that. I can see myself. I see myself. I see you. I see Gaspar. And I don't know.
No. It's just a black screen, but
This is strange because my camera is on, you know?
maybe turn it off and turn it on again.
Okay.
Yes.
Now we see you.
Okay. So sorry for this, but it's not easy from this perspective. Okay, so you probably are asking yourselves why I stopped on these African populations and Afrofuturism and critical populations of Sadaya Hartman and Tavia Nyong'o. But this is for me very important because they are talking about not changing and repairing the past, but also opening space for new discoveries. Because they are now dealing with black histories and all, you know, the problems of slavery and all the archives and all the stories that have been or suppressed or completely erased. So there is a whole process of reconstruction of something that has been completely destroyed from the past. But if we now zoom out to the entire field of performance studies, at least the one we are able to see, we can also say that the very queer theory of color has intervened in a similar fashion in performance studies, revisiting its predominantly white, Western, and Anglophone heritage and opening space for the discoveries of the previously excluded from the field. Still looking at Venice Biennale and other festivals, the art of other geographical areas are always presented as a fragment of the global Western universal art history. This is the instance of a vertical historical narration that is characterized by a hierarchical approach. From this standpoint, the art canons, hierarchies of value and stylistic norms are all created in the center, while in the peripheries they need to be received and assimilated. If it happens that significant artists appear in peripheries, then the recognition and consecration must happen within the center with either Western exhibition, production and publication, otherwise they do not exist. It is not enough to mention a few such cases, and you know all well Marina Abramović, Oliver Frljić, Biljana Srdjanović or Selma Selman. For example, there are other great artists from the area, such as Dušan Jovanović and Ljubiša Ristić, for that matter. They were never recognized widely in spite of the international promotions, tours and translations. And there are many examples as such. One could go back in time and reconsider what happened regarding Dada and Surrealism in Yugoslavia that are mentioned only in passing, if they are mentioned, if ever, in the histories of these avant-garde movements. Modernism and its mutations and anti-modernism and postmodernism, etc., have been always considered an inherently West phenomena and has, from a modernist perspective, have a universal significance. And although it was difficult, we all know this, that East European artists had problems to maintain contacts with Western art scene, still the art produced in East should be considered European. This is something that also Piotrowski noticed. Therefore, it is clear that in order to produce a historical account of the regional art, one has to pay close attention to the political and social context of the reception of particular West trends. This is a very complex task because the context always changes in a dramatic way that influences the artwork. The internal dynamics of a given culture, its selective adoption and absorption of particular models. Sometimes it happened that Western art models were used in the local context as an instrument of resistance against cultural appropriation, colonialism, and imperial dominance of West. Therefore, East European art may have had a different meaning than art produced in West, but it was produced within the sphere of Western influence. It also served as a resistance to the cultural policies of socialist states. And again, Marina Abramović worked with the whole group which collaborated with the Student Culture Center in Belgrade. Then you have here in Slovenia OFO group, then Gorgona. They all worked against the mainstream socialist culture, but using what was considered a Western art movements. So, however, as Piotr Piotrowski has noticed, the critique of vertical paradigm is not easy. Perhaps we should go back in history and speak about Warburgian method. I don't know if some of you know who A.B. Warburg was, but he was an art historian who completely changed the art history, introducing new models in art history. And it was not how do you say, one direction, one line art history about West Europe, but he was using other examples and other histories to create a more global history. And he could be considered one of the first scholars who created the performance paradigm. However, there is very little or almost no reference of him in performance studies. If A.B. Warburg is mentioned at all, it is only in comparison to similar methodologies found in the history of theater and performance. The concept that Warburg introduced in the traditional discipline of art history, such as Ausdruck, which is expression, pathos formel, language of gestures, Nachleben der Antike, afterlife or survival of antiquity, Einfühlung, empathy, and Mnemosyne, in a certain way anticipated performance studies. While Georges Didi Huberman finds Warburg's work prophetic or as a prediction of a knowledge that will come to us in the future, Giorgio Agamben claims that Warburg created a discipline that is without a proper name. When Warburg did his research in Florence at the end of the 19th century, he was already changing the history of art out of indignation with the ongoing aestheticization, abandoning Rosarian venerating artistic histories and/or Hegelian universal meaning of history of art. Foreseeing Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, Warburg immersed himself in the unhierarchical world of archives in a number of private collections in Florence, finding in them a huge quantity of raw material, both moving and unlimited, suitable for reinventing the history of Renaissance, but at the same time for profoundly changing the art history as an academic discipline. Already between 1900 and 1906, having accumulated an astonishing number of books, manuscripts, notes, and documents, Warburg started to construct his own library, as then crowned a space for thinking. The library was organized in a rhizomatic way in which certain improbable and unknown concepts for the history of art were inserted, but without the pretension for a definitive synthesis or absolute knowledge. Thus, Warburg Library could be defined a work in progress, an open and flexible construct that in a certain way preceded the World Wide Web through creating unusual links and opening up to others. His library ended up being a kind of uncommon archive rather than a specialized library in which he multiplied and confronted different sources, creating a real archaeology of the fields of knowledge that are linked to what today are called human sciences, a theoretical archaeology centered from the start on the twofold question of forms and symbols. It was with this library that Warburg placed the foundation for the so-called science of art, Kunstwissenschaft, or even for the cultural field in the general, Kulturwissenschaft, that opened the path for the interdisciplinary studies. If Warburg made art history a critical discipline par excellence, then he also unlocked the door to performance studies, bravely leaving the space for the unknown and for the strangers. So, Piotr Piotrowski proposes a similar thing, a paradigm of horizontal art history as an alternative to the vertical one. Of course, a point of departure in constructing such a paradigm should be a deconstruction of vertical or West art history. The goal, of course, is not to diminish the contribution of West art history, but rather to identify and name its narration as Western and to separate it from the universal art and place it in relation to other historic narrations and to conduct a process of de-hierarchization. One of its consequences would be a rejection of traditional relationship between West art history and art history of others. Although the influence of West art is undeniable, it would be also useful to study the influence of non-Western art on Western art. When a method of micro-histories and an experience of the margins would be applied, then one should return to analyze the center, and then we would realize that the West art was not nearly as orthodox and homogeneous as we thought. So now I would like to just, do I have a little bit more time?
Yes, yes, you have.
Okay, thank you. Because now I would like just to mention, now lately I have been studying this French historian, Ivan Jablonka, or Jablonka, I prefer to call him Jablonka, that claims that being a historian does not preclude one from talking about one's family. And in Ivan Jablonka, I found this model, methodology, how we should study East European art. He was talking about his family, but it does not offer the use of unique vocabulary to describe it, the language of the social sciences. His attempt at the family biography is both a private and public reflection about the fate of his family, and he speaks about them not as if theirs was a unique, remarkable destiny, but rather as one that traversed and was perhaps determined by broader social forces. His book, A History of the Grandparents I Never Had, is a reflection on the fate of his family, but it is also an essay on history writing. And here I would like to connect him to what I was mentioning before, the research we did on dissident news in the theater, how one reconstructed a non-existing theater history of East Europe, because many of the things were or either prohibited or censored or hidden, or samizdat, or there was a hidden language used all the time. Jablonka's father's parents were born in Poland in the early 20th century. As officials in the local Communist Party, which was of course illegal at the time, they were sentenced to live 5 years, they were sentenced to 5 years in prison. On their release, they migrated to France without a visa and settled in Paris in the late 1930s. A few years later, they were arrested and deported to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. To summarize, we can say that they spent their entire lives in hiding, first in Poland as communists, then in France as illegal immigrants, and finally under the Vichy regime as Jews. These three clandestine lives, three absences from the world until the ultimate one, their annihilation in the context of genocide. If their life was short and tragic, it is because they were manipulated by one totalitarian and destroyed by another under the indifferent gaze of the so-called democracies. Jablonka introduced three methodological tools: the use of I, the need for distance and reflexivity, and the relationship between history and memory. The first method is the use of the I in a history book. The hermeneutic tradition from Wilhelm Dilthey to Paul Ricoeur, as well as Eric Hobsbawm, stresses the importance of subjectivity in all stages of historiography. The choice of topic, the cross-checking of archives, the timeline and the tempo of the narrative, among other concerns. The historian can also use the I in a more conscious way. Many works are rooted in a personal tropism. This or that historian of the countryside, of the Communist Party, of immigration, or of the Holocaust is personally involved or touched by his/her object of study. In recent decades, the practice of ergo history has invited historians to reflect on their own journey or social origin. But to talk about one's family as a researcher is to go one step further, he believes, in terms of intimacy. In his work, the I has at least two functions. His family is central to his study, and his investigation is fully part of the narrative. In other words, he uses what sociologists and anthropologists call their field notes, visible and public. And from this, there is a double structure of his narrative. A historian tells the history of his grandparents' life, and at the same time the story of the research that allowed him to reconstruct their lives. This is what he would attempt, to implement this double I in a history book. He refuses the term as if of the impersonal narrative of the past that speaks for itself and springs fully formed from the brain of the historian. And here I quote Jablonka, "I dream of a history in which the I would be the guarantee of the most objective research for its corrupting principle. But under what conditions? For it is very clear that an excess of subjectivity would kill the research." This leads him to the second issue. Excuse me, the need for reflexivity. All search requires distance. In this case, he did not have to make a great effort. The distance was imposed on him by death itself. His grandmother died at the age of 28, and grandfather at the age of 34 or 35. Since their lives ended long before his began, and since his father was separated from them when he was barely 3 years old, Mates and Idesa Jablonka are as much his relatives as absolute strangers. But just as he recognizes the distance, he explained how he tried to reduce it. Thus he obeyed what he calls the imperative of transparency, choosing to show everything about his work as a historian. His hypotheses, research, problems, hesitations, doubts, successes and failures. This transparency seemed necessary if only to show that the archives he was used were not a given, not a chance discovery in some random attic, but the result of a long research. As a struggle against obscurity and oblivion, the story of his grandparents' lives are inseparable from the efforts that have allowed him to find their traces in more than 20 archives in Poland and France, and from the testimony of the many witnesses who agreed to talk to him about their parents, about the immigration and the war. To take the reader behind the scenes, so to speak, and to quote Jablonka, into the workshop of the historian is a way of showing that the understanding of the past is not a result, but a process, a quest, if not a conquest of what has been. The third challenge is the relationship between history and memory. His work consists in writing a biography, even if it is a family biography, and even if it is at the edge of the genre. Biography is one of the only exercises that give rise to a total history, a fully sociological one, individual and collective, micro-historical and global, transversal and transnational. To that extent, the biographical genre is exciting for the social historian that Jablonka obviously is. To write the biography of an unknown person is both a temptation and supreme challenge. But to look back on the ashes of those who have disappeared is inextricably a work of both history and memory. Jablonka wanted to write a micro-history of the Holocaust in which the protagonists would be alive with their rebellions and their failures, their preoccupations and their normality, and not being people who were merely doomed for death. By retracing the journey of his grandparents, Jablonka tried to give them back the abundance of their lives, the profusion of their freedom. As a book of memory and transmission, the biography of two young people, Jablonka's book is a devotion to life, but it is also a tomb, a memorial made out of paper, the cenotaph that we built for the absent. Jablonka tried to find the most appropriate way to speak about genocide between history and literature by adopting an ethic that would grow at the same time from a need for accuracy, a promise to tell the truth, and the feeling of being indebted. In doing so, he attempted to go beyond what he believed to be false oppositions. Science altered by the narrative, family history versus capital H, history threatened by memory. Therefore, for me, this is, I don't know, like what Sadaya Hartman did with the book called Lose Your Mother, and this Jablonka book, The History of My Grandparents That I Never Met, are two seminal books for the narratives of the history of East European art and even for other histories. I think this is one of the methods that should be applied in the writing the history of East European performance art history, in order, of course, to understand the present. And to quote Jablonka, can one ever be attached to the country that has sent one's families to death? What happened between the incarceration of my grandfather in 1939 for lack of papers and my career as a French historian? What social alchemy am I a product of? My books are the public and socially useful answer that I give to these questions. The ties that bind me to the past, grandson of the courtesan, son of an orphan, French scholar, make up the threads that run through all my research. Today, still, as I walk through the birch woods of Birkenau, I am the grandson of two undesirable people, a historical reality I promise myself never to forget. So I'm sure that most of us in this part of the world have this kind of family histories which need to be reconstructed and written as micro-histories. Therefore, East Europeans, as the other, must look at themselves, define their own position and location from which one speaks. For example, the concept of transnationalism should be employed in the construction of horizontal art history as a polyphonic, multidimensional, devoid of geographical hierarchies. Of course, this open model of micro-performing art histories should also rely on the concepts borrowed from the fields other than critical geography, namely based on gender, ethnic, and subcultural perspectives that were previously mentioned. So here I will stop myself, and I would like now to show two videos which will show you, which were they were screened at the same in the same year in 1997, and in some ways they are similar, but in some ways they are completely different. And you can show, one is, which one you will show, Gregor? Gaspar, which one you will show for first?
You want shirtology?
Okay. Probably you all know Jérôme Bell and his work, and this is one of his first works in 1997, Shirtology, which was done in February of 1997 in Lisbon, and there were many performances after. It has been repeated as a choreography. It is that kind of genre between performance art and dance, also called non-choreography. So I would like to show you first 3 minutes. Okay. Okay, I think we can stop here.
Okay.
Now we can show the other one. So I don't know if you hear the sound of this video, which is not the best, but I just wanted to explain. This is the video done by Milica Tomic. It's called XY Ungelost, and it was done for the October Salon in 1997, and talks about the demonstration in Kosovo on the occasion of the change of the constitution from the 1974 on March 28, 1989, when 33 citizens of Albanian nationality were killed in Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. She did this with her friends, and it's like going on in loop, but this is only a small part which I found. Okay, so this is it.